I'm with CloudM as head of partnerships and looking after partnerships, as my title says. We're delighted to be here today. And yeah, so looking forward to the session. And I hand over to Umar, is it?
Yeah, thank you, Marco. Yeah, so lovely to meet you all. My name is Umar. I'm one of the architects here over at CloudM. So I deal mainly with the technical side of sales. I've been here about 3.5 years now, so I've got a very good understanding of our tooling. And today I'll be doing the demonstration. So lovely to meet you all.
Appreciate it. And I guess my introduction, my name's Harry. I'm one of the account managers at CloudM, so I deal specifically with the guys at CDU. So any questions, queries that you may have, fire through to the guys at CDU, and I'm sure it'll come back to me at some point. So if you joined the first webinar, so I was away on holiday, so I missed it. A bit of irony in that, which was about a month or so ago. You may have seen this, but we'll run through it again. And this is just a bit of background, I guess, on CloudM and who we are. So CloudM, we started in, I think it was 2008 initially as a migration technology. So we aided people in moving their data to Google from, or God knows, wherever it was that they were keeping at the time. Still to this day, we will be a migration tool. We will always continue to develop. You know, I guess more now we see cloud-to-cloud migrations. Obviously, that's just the way the world's moved on. But it's from that migration technology, we've actually realized it's a little bit more powerful than just one-off migrations. So rather than just helping people to get into Google, what can we do once they land on there? How can we save them time and money by automating a lot of what can be very manual and laborious processes within Google? How can we increase data governance and resilience? So we provide something like backup solutions. How do we make sure that data is backed up continuously? But then things like brand management, email signatures, something that obviously can be rolled out in education and may be applicable. And on the right-hand side there are just some of the things that we love to shout about. So we are a Google Cloud Premier Partner. We have done over 80 million migrations. They have taken place in 107 countries. Hell of a lot of customers, you can see. And we have dedicated teams, depending on where you are in the world, because as we just alluded to, people are joining in their morning, their evening, and on their lunch. You know, we have to make sure that we cover people wherever they are. So that's a little bit of a background on CloudM. Now, what are we actually going to speak about today? So on the right-hand side there that you can see is what we call our CloudM modules. Now, on the previous session, the one in blue at the top, CloudM Migrate was covered. And obviously, if you want to go and watch that, I think it's on the AppCDU YouTube channel. And feel free to go and listen to that with the team. Today, we're going to talk about 3 other modules, and they're the ones that are highlighted in green. So our CloudM Backup Solution, which does, as it says on the tin, it is a backup solution for your Google Workspace data. CloudM Email Signatures, and again, very easy to understand, that is an email signature solution. And then finally, CloudM Automate. And Umar is going to dive into this, you know, in much greater detail than I am now. But our Automate solution is all about our onboarding and our offboarding of users, which in education, if there's a high turnover of staff or indeed students, how do we make life as easy as possible for you? So as people transition through year groups, maybe transitioning through roles, we want to assist in that. So you'll be glad to know that is the end of my speaking slot, because I know that you guys are super technical and want to see things and understand how they look, work and feel. And this is where I'm going to very kindly hand the baton back over to Umar, who is going to demo all of those things. Umar, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Harry. So for those of you who may have not seen our tooling, whether you have, we'll do a quick refresher. And I'll start by sharing my screen. Yeah, no worries, Charles. It's absolutely fine. And maybe just give me a thumbs up when you can actually see my screen. So I've just shared that now. Oh, yes, perfect. Okay, so let's dive straight into this. Okay, so for those of you that have never seen the tool, quick refresher, this tool is actually installed via the Google Workspace Marketplace. So you may have seen in the last session that you actually can install Migrate this way through like a hosted solution. And you can have it self-hosted, whereas CloudM Automate or CloudM automation tooling can only be installed via the Workspace Marketplace. Okay, so it's hosted in Google App Engine and deployed. And if I click in the top right corner here, I call it the waffle icon in Google. The same way you access your Gmail and Drive is the same way you actually access CloudM automation. Okay, so if we click through to this, this will prompt us to sign in with Google as our SSO. Google is acting as the SSO in this, so it is tied to the Google account. And the idea here is it's a sort of layer 2 automation platform to the admin console. So for everybody aware of the admin console, you obviously store the users, the groups, the OUs, and you can do much more in terms of security. And once installed, this actually syncs back and forth every 12 to 24 hours with the admin console. And there are a few features in CloudM which sort of plug the gaps in which Google make quite difficult, which we'll get onto. So this is the actual homepage. We have 2 dashboards. This is a brand new dashboard that we've just launched for our backup solution. And it just gives you some nice metrics of, well, what's been successful, what's failed, and then we can actually view these reports and maybe re-kick off some backups. We also back up not just users, but in addition to this, share drives, and we'll get into much more detail around the backup module, which you can see here on the left-hand side with a nice new ribbon, as you can see. So once we've installed this tool, you can see all our modules are listed on the left-hand side. I will specifically exclude archive, simply because the value of archive from a sort of business perspective is to save money on AU licenses, but in the education space, it's not really relevant because you get that for free, right? So today we're going to cover automate, backup, and email signatures. Okay, let's cover the directory first. So I mentioned a few gaps that we essentially plug in the Google Admin Console. So if I was to click in the directory, as I mentioned, all the OUs, all the groups, all the users, they all sync across. So typically, customers, they have large enterprise infrastructure. They'll have HR systems that sync into IDP systems that eventually sync into Google, and CloudM just plug and plays directly after Google. That infrastructure may sync back to AD, and that's exactly where CloudM just fits in this entire picture for those who have large infrastructures. What can I do if I click into a user? So if I click into Alexandra Berry or Amar, who's active, and I click actions, a couple of things that are quite useful here that you typically cannot do in the admin console very easily. So delegating mailbox access and managing out of office without having to log in as the end user. Okay, that's quite important because typically if you wanted to do that as an admin, you then have to log in as that user, you then have to reset their password, and then it becomes a bit of a compliance issue at that point because you have to reset the password. We can just do this directly in the interface itself from an incoming delegation or an outgoing delegation. Okay. One of the other key features of this menu is being able to manage out of office, again, without having to set or without having to log in as the user. And we can also schedule offboarding. So we'll get into the automation piece now of you can offboard a user, or you can actually set specific end dates and times. So if you have users, you can set those, and then the automation will just trigger at that time. Okay. What does that automation actually look like though? So if I navigate into automate here at the bottom, just below, automate comprises of 3 things, right? So we saw that user management menu, onboarding and offboarding. Admittedly, offboarding is much more popular than onboarding in our solution. We are sort of going on a journey of building out onboarding a little bit more, but this panel is going to be very familiar as I navigate through this application. And the idea is you are able to create policies, whether that's backup policies, offboarding policies, onboarding, email signatures, and you can assign these policies to different levels. So you can set it on the base level, so having a policy for everyone. You can override that per OU. A lot of organizations are OU driven rather than group driven. But then if they are group driven, that's absolutely fine. You can override both of them by assigning a policy to a group. How are the changes that CloudM does in the workspace logged? That's a very good question. Will it be clear? So in the investigation tool, this is very important. If I navigate to settings, it's a great question. I will be able to click into domain settings. And in the investigation tool, it will be acting and logged as the admin account. So the idea here is all the actions interact through the API via a delegated service account, and that will be listed as who the domain admin is. Okay, I hope that answers your question there, Martin. If I navigate back to Automate on the left side, what can we do with onboarding? We can automatically provision documents, calendars, and share drives for new starters. So this predominantly solves the problem of, I don't have access to this. Where do I get access? Who do I need to speak to? What you can actually do is, whether it's calendars, shared drives, or specific documents, you can then automate the assignment of these. So when somebody joins, like a new starter, they automatically can see that in their calendar, for example, or in their drive. Okay, and you can also set the permissions, right? So if I click into the permissions, you can set whether that's read or write only. Okay. Admittedly, offboarding, like I mentioned, is a much more deeper conversation that we typically have with customers, because our tooling revolves around a retention. Okay, so if you notice backup, offboarding, the archive, even though we're not covering archive, this essentially builds a bigger picture and a deeper conversation that we have with customers around data retention. Okay, and you can see we have a total of 36 steps at the moment. We're constantly building this out. And the idea here is we want to streamline how we want to keep data, whether staff leave, whether students leave in the education space. It's all about streamlining that process. Okay, so it can all start with a request for approval. But who does that go to? So if I navigate into the settings, you can decide, does that need to go to, let's say, a senior member of staff or somebody specific? You can actually type that in. And you can see as I type in my name, the IntelliSense pops up and it's showing me an active user in the workspace that I can select as a decision maker for this workflow. Okay, now remember the value, you can have multiple workflows across multiple levels. You can segregate this out for staff, for students, for different groups of users. Okay, and you can chop and change all of those steps. How are these workflows triggered? So we have 5 ways. The first way you can see here is through the suspension of the account. So what you can do is you can, depending on where that gets suspended, whether that's in Google or whether that's in an external system that eventually leads up to Google, that can send an immediate push notification to our application. And then you can actually, if I click away from the workflow, monitor exactly all the students or all the staff that are currently in flight in the education sort of context. So if I click into Ben here, you can see this is where he is at in his workflow. And these are all the steps which are actually queued to be executed. And this is pretty much where the admin of CloudM would live. Okay. The other few ways how we trigger this, okay, is through API. So we can hit our endpoints directly. We don't need to do anything through the interface. So that's 2. But we saw 2 of them previously through this directory menu here on the left. I click into users. And as I mentioned, you can set the end date and time. So that's the 3rd way. You can offboard the user directly in the tool. That's the 4th way. And we have a brand new 5th way coming in about a month's time, which is currently in development, where the trigger can be moving the user to a specific OU. Okay, so that's the 5th way that is currently in development. If I click back into the offboarding workflow, let's go through some of the steps here. Okay, no worries, Martin. Let's go through some of the steps here. So we talked about the request for approval. Every step has a trash can icon next to it, okay, and a delay icon. So you can really get flexible with what steps you want, whether that's per OU or per group, but also if you want to add any delays, the most popular use case for that would be right at the end of the workflow, just before you delete the account. That's the best use case that I've seen for delays, okay? But what are the steps then? So we can start with an approval. We can wipe devices such as Chrome and mobile. We can allocate resources on the fly post execution of the workflow. That's really an edge case step. So if you want to assign documents to somebody else rather than the executor after the workflow has been triggered. That's the step that matters there. And then we have 6 steps for security. Okay, so changing the password, revoking 2-step, making sure no external applications can actually access the account by clearing tokens. This is a brand new step that we've recently implemented. So if I'm a manager of a profile, another user, and I leave, then I can be removed as their manager, okay, from their profile. Okay. We can revoke existing delegations. So I mentioned that in the directory tab, you can do that on an ad hoc basis, but you can also delegate access as part of the automation. And this is actually a inspiration from one of our customers who wanted to revoke the delegations. And typically when you delete the account, that happens anyway, but this specific customer didn't delete accounts. They just sort of kept them available. So we decided to take that feedback and implement this step. So does this link to any MIS Arbor in particular? I'm not too familiar with those. Is that some software, or do a quick search? We can speak about this in the Q&A.
Yeah, let's come to that in the Q&A. It's probably going to be a more in-depth one. It's around MIS or SAS, student databases for schools. Yeah,
sure.
It will definitely come back to that.
Okay, I appreciate that. Okay, yeah, so let's proceed through the workflow and see how this all ties together then. So as I mentioned, we can revoke the existing delegate access, set out of office messages, remove any forwarding. We've seen how we can do this one manually, delegating the mailbox access. Move the user to a different OU. That's very common practice, regardless of education or private businesses. Hide the user from the global address list. Reroute mail. These 2 steps come as a package. Okay, this is important to understand. So when we rename the original user to something like archived.umar@cloudm.io, we can then assign my original email address if I was leaving to my manager. So all new emails that are coming in can be deflected and rerouted, should I say, to a manager. Now, I want you to pay attention to the blue labels. Blue labels are really important because that means even though we've set a default decision maker, we can override those decision makers within each individual step. Okay, so you can get flexible with overrides. So you may, the best use case for that would be, I want the manager to receive everything, but actually I have this Google Work admin console sort of service account, which I just store everything in to actually have, let's say, all the documents. That's valid, okay? And then we arrive at archive. So we're not going to speak about archive today because it's not very, it doesn't really have a value proposition in the education space. But the idea here is it essentially copies all the data to save on AU licenses. And within this workflow, we can purge backups in the backup bucket. Okay, or that's really useful if you want for that data to go into archive, but like I said, it's not really relevant. This is a really popular step. So we're transferring ownership of existing documents that leaver had in a systematic fashion. This tackles the problem of a user leaving, their account being deleted, 20 days have passed in Google, the 20-day rule in Google, and then somebody eventually asks IT, I need access to this document. It was in my drive. It was shared with me. But lo and behold, that user has left. Their account's been deleted and we can't get it back because 20 days have passed. Okay, so that's really useful for keeping everything quite organized. We can migrate calendar events, transfer ownership of groups, contacts, any shared drives they've created, even if they're owning a Google Data Studio, we can transfer the ownership of that. So this is very much an ownership piece in those 4 steps of transferring. And then we can remove the user from groups. This was actually the old way of retaining emails before we developed backup and archive. We can literally just migrate the whole mailbox to a different user if that's required. Not hugely popular, but I've seen use cases for it. And then the final steps are to actually suspend the user or apply in AU, right? So that's very valid. That's actually more valid in the education space because if you're keeping the account, then you can just you don't need to do that manually. You can get the automation to just delete this step here, suspend user, and then apply AU, keeping that account. And then, as I said, you can add a delay at the end, should you want to delete the account after 60 days, 90 days, a year, something like that. So that's really the automate. So we've quick recap. What have we seen so far before we move into backup and email signatures? We've seen how to install the tool and how that sort of sits within infrastructure. We've seen how that syncs with the admin console through OUs, users, and groups. We've seen how to basically manage users using the directory, and how automate is what it entails. So onboarding and offboarding, and complementing that directory management. And that is automate from a very high level. Now we're going to tackle backup and email signatures. Okay, so being very transparent, automate is popular for sort of that leavers process. But then just before the leavers process, when users join, they are active. Therefore, they need to be backed up. Okay, so we have a lot of customers that are interested with new legislation coming around this too. They're looking for a backup solution, for example. And then if I click backup, it all starts with the storage configuration. Okay, so this really syncs with Google Cloud Platform storage. Okay, the storage module specifically. How does this work? So the end customer will own their own storage. This is how we pretty much differ from our competitors, because the typical backup business model is that you are tied to your vendor and they own your data. Whereas CloudM, we sort of take a reverse approach. We encourage the end customers to own their own data utilizing Google Cloud Storage or AWS storage. We can provide both. And the way this works is when you're connecting up, you would provide some credentials such as your bucket name, and then you would have to create a service account within GCP so we can securely read and write. Okay. And then we have retention periods. So we actually cater for retention in order to manage those storage costs. So when users stop backing up and then they sort of embark on that leavers process, that automation, we can decide for how long do we want to retain that information before it's automatically purged. Okay. If I navigate to the top tab here, we have, as I mentioned, we have something called policies. After we've hooked up our storage, connected it to CloudM, we can then create default policies for users and shared drives. Okay, what are policies? They're simply just blueprints, right? They just tell you what you need to back up or want to back up and how long you want to back them up for. So even though we had a global retention period that we could set on the storage configuration level, we can actually have local retention periods for specific groups or OUs of users. We are releasing calendar, which you will see should you want to explore this application further in about a month. So mail, drive, and calendar will be available. As of present right now, it's just mail and drive. Okay. Now, once we create a policy, what do we do with it? Well, if I navigate to the top tab here, remember I said this is going to be a very familiar screen that you're going to see throughout the application. We saw it with onboarding, we saw it with offboarding, and now we're seeing it with backup. So we can assign those policies to individual levels, okay? And the use case of that is if you have custom retention periods. We can also, everything you've seen up until now has been on a sort of user basis and a user level, but with backup, it's a little bit different because you can actually back up shared drives as well. Okay. Once you assign those policies, that's the trigger to start backing up, right? So if I was to click on the account managers, and I was to assign a policy, that's going to trigger the backups in the back end. There will be two backups that happen, the initial backup and then incremental recurring backups, okay? This is all powered by our migration technology, right? So in the last session, you saw how when you run a migration, you will run it in two phases. So that's a bulk phase and then a delta phase. Very, very similar in this respect. No worries, Wolfgang. You have a great day. So once we assign a policy to any level, it's 4 hours. Every 4 hours, we are capturing the changes. And every 20 minutes, we're capturing mail changes. Okay. And if we ever need to restore information from our backups, we have two types, right? So we have a full restoration and we have a partial restoration. So we can restore a group of users, whether that's an entire OU or whether that's a specific set of shared drives. And if I click into a user, I have this calendar function here. So I can actually restore specific time periods. This is a full restoration, but I can restore from a specific time period or maybe just everything. If I navigate to item restore here at the top, this is more granular, right? So this allows you to actually see the mail, see the drive, and be able to not only restore this back into the workspace, but we can actually download this locally in Microsoft format. Where is that? We can actually restore folders as well. So this is one of our recent releases as well. So as well as being able to restore files and download files, you can restore full folders as well back into the workspace. And this will end up in the user's drive with a specific naming convention of choice. And that will just carry on running. So remember, backup is mainly for your active users once they join the organization. Offboarding, that middle piece around the retention narrative, that's for the leavers. And then we've covered the directory, and now we'll cover email signatures. So this is a little bit off topic in terms of the retention, but it does land pretty well with our customers, which is why we sell it, right? So the idea here is you can build out a signature library and with a specific editor. So if I click into a signature, you can create signatures based off templates just to get started. And then you can design this signature through sort of table-based format, or you can just view the source code and just copy and paste the table-based HTML inline CSS code. And you can see here we have $signs, which represent variables. So this ties into this idea that we are centrally managing signatures across the board. Okay, so if I navigate down to predefined extra information, as well as the standard information, you can actually create custom attributes in the admin console, hook them up into CloudM, and then we can essentially output custom profile pictures, social media profiles, pronouns. These are some good use cases of custom information that you may want to put in the email signature. How do we manage them? In the exact same fashion as offboarding policies and backup policies, a very familiar screen once again. So whether we want to have one signature for everyone, whether we want to have separate signatures for OUs or groups, we can do this and apply this to different levels. A nice little neat feature here for the larger organizations, aliases. So we can have separate signatures for separate aliases, right? So if the typical use case here is acquisitions. So whether a trust acquires a new school, that might be an alias, for example, you can have a separate signature for that, okay? We can schedule signatures. So if I click schedule signature, add the signature, I can choose which signature I want to schedule. And then I can use the calendar function here to actually decide how long do I want that to run. And when we actually tie this, so if I click on the left side and I click settings, roles, when you first install the application, there will only be a default administrator that has access to the app. And then they are then responsible for bringing in new users. And this ties directly into email signatures because that can be outsourced to different departments. So role-based access essentially controls what you can see on this left-hand side and what you can do in the application by that directory menu or that configuration menu of offboarding, onboarding, backup, email signatures. And the last thing I'll leave you with here is if I click into email signatures here and management, we've seen how we can run campaigns, we can have aliases, schedule the signatures. You can actually, when you're designing your signature, you can actually preview what that's going to look like for a specific user. So, and what that's going to look like on mobile and desktop. Okay. So what have we covered today? Quick roundup from a very high level. We've covered how the application is installed or how it's hosted. via the Workspace Marketplace hosted in Google App Engine. And we've covered each module, automate, backup, and email signatures, and how they can essentially streamline automation in the Google Workspace.